Okay, guys, before we go on to chapter 17, lesson 3, I want to review what we talked about in lesson 1 and lesson 2. Abe Lincoln's main goal was to take the two pieces of the country, the Union and the Confederacy, and put those two pieces back together. Unfortunately, he was unable to do that because he was assassinated. When he was assassinated, Andrew Johnson, his vice president, becomes the president. And Andrew Johnson struggles to get anything done because every time Congress passes a law, he would veto it. They would override his veto, he would veto again. So eventually, they try to impeach him and remove him from office. They are one vote short of removing him. You must be tired. So the next election comes, and the country is ready for a change, and they elect a man who they saw to be a war hero. They elect Ulysses Grant. And one reason he's able to win the election is it's the first time many African Americans are allowed to vote, and they vote for him since he fought to free them. Okay, guys, say bye, why not? So the Reconstruction Acts were set up to rebuild the South after the Civil War. There was a lot of rules that came along with the Reconstruction Acts, and what happened is anyone who was part of the Confederacy was never allowed to hold a political office again. Other people in the South were allowed to hold office, and during this time, about 16 African Americans served in Congress. So things are improving for people in the South, but it's not all better. A lot of the freedmen are still going to struggle, and they're going to be taken advantage of. So in South Carolina, there were people who would help freedmen get elected. So they would help these people who used to be slaves get elected into office, and then they would basically use them and manipulate them as puppets, because a lot of the freedmen didn't know how to read. They didn't know the rules of the government, so they would get elected and be used and manipulated. And the ones who manipulated them were known as scalawags. So a scalawag is someone who uses and manipulates people. So the South was destroyed after the war, and some people were coming down honestly to help, to try to fix things, to try to make things better, but other people came down to try to get rich off of the problems. So the good people came down, and they were teachers, they were nurses trying to help in the hospitals, but some of the people came down, made promises, promised to fix things, promised to make things better for the freedmen, and basically what they did was they made all of these empty promises, took the money, and they ran. Those people were known as carpetbaggers. So what happened to the giant plantations, the big farms after the war? They were no longer allowed to use slaves. So what that's going to mean is the amount of money they're making off of their crops goes down. So they have to pay people to work on their farms now. Even though they're paying people, they are paying the freedmen. If they're paying them at all, they're paying them very, very little. Many of these plantation owners knew they couldn't make as much money off of their farms anymore if they couldn't force slaves to work for free. So they had to figure out another way to make money, and they did something called tenant farming. And a tenant is someone who rents property off of you. So what these big farm owners would do is they would rent out a small piece of their farm to the freedmen, and these former slaves would work on the farm, and then they would have to sell the crops and pay rent to the farm owner. This was a pretty sweet deal for the farm owners because they're not doing the work and they're getting paid the rent. And why it was so dirty is no matter how hard the freedmen worked, they were ending up with far less money than the farmer. So they're doing all of the work and getting hardly anything out of it. So some of the big plantation owners would let slaves have land to farm for free. And anytime you're getting something for free, you should be suspicious. What they would do is they would let them have this land, not have to pay rent, but in return, at the end of the season, they're going to take most of the crops you grew. So imagine you do all of the work. The farmer sets you up with a place to stay. He gives you some seeds, gives you some tools. But at the end of the season, when you grow all of your crops, he's taking all of it. So if he's taking all of it from you and you are getting paid very little or even nothing, what's going to happen is you're basically back to being a slave again. Sometimes after the farm owner would give you the land for free and let you farm on it, he'd set you up with the tools, set you up with the seeds for free the first time. The next time he might want payment for the seeds, payment for the tools. And what's going to happen at the end of the season when you're done, you give him the crops and he says, hey, that's not enough. You actually owe me $100 extra. And every year that's going to repeat and you're going to owe more and more and more. So no matter how hard they worked, they would end up being poorer and poorer until they were basically working for nothing again. And they were back to being slaves. So before and during the Civil War, the main crop the South was growing was cotton. And the reason they grew it is because it was valuable. You can't eat cotton. All they would do is they would take it and they would sell it. And we were making 75% of the world's cotton at that time. So we're making tons of money off of it. But after the war is over and they can't use slaves to pick the cotton anymore, many of the farms switched to growing other things like pecans, peanuts, corn, wheat, fruits, and vegetables. All of those things are planted because those become more valuable now because you can actually eat and use those. They no longer have to depend on the three main crops, tobacco, cotton, and rice. So, during the Civil War, there was lots of changes too. We talked about this in the last chapter where many women volunteered to help out in the army. Some of them actually fought alongside their husbands. Many of them were nurses taking care of the wounded soldiers. And women in the South had to take care of the farms when their husbands went off to go fight. So their role has changed quite a bit. Women are starting to get recognized for being strong, and they are demanding the same rights as men. So after the war is over, industry starts to expand. And remember, industry means factories and businesses. Women start to look for jobs outside of the house, and since they have jobs now, they get more independence, and they start to seek suffrage. And suffrage sounds like you're in pain, but that word actually means the right to vote. So after the Civil War is over, the South is going to change a lot. They used to make all their money off of plantation and farming, but things are going to start to change. Down in the South, they discover that they actually have a lot of iron ore. And iron ore is a rock that can be processed and turned into metal. Birmingham, Alabama became one of the major steel producing cities. So because of these new businesses, the towns and cities are going to get larger, and the South is going to start to change. It's going to look a lot less country and start to have more cities and business centers. Before the war, the South had paid very little attention to education. If you were wealthy enough and you could afford to do it, people would send their children to private school. They weren't required to go to public school. But during Reconstruction, the states started to require the people to go to school, require the children afterwards. The schools were segregated, and segregated means split based on race. So they were requiring all children to go to school, but they had separate schools for the white and the black children. Okay, this is one of the worksheets that goes along with the lesson we just did. I'm going to help you out and get you started on about 2 of the answers. So 1 down. The landowners took a large part of the crops of blank. Who were they renting out part of their property to? They were letting people use part of their land for free, and they wanted the crops in return. Those people were called sharecroppers. So 1 down is going to be sharecropper. Next, we'll take a look at 2 across. After the war, women demanded blank that had been denied to them. They demanded freedom. They demanded privileges. What's another word for privileges? So 2 across is going to be rights. So you can fill in the rest of those using the clues at the bottom and using what we highlighted. Let's flip it over and I will help you out with 2 questions on the multiple choice side as well. So let's look at number 1. According to Congress's Reconstruction Acts, blank lost the right to hold government office. So who was being punished for what happened during the Civil War? The answer is D, the Confederate political leaders. They were no longer allowed to hold government office. And let's jump down to number 9. A sharecropper's blank kept getting bigger and bigger. So no matter how hard they worked, they owed more and more money each year. And another word for owing money is debt. And I'm feeling generous, so we'll do 1 more. Number 10. Both sharecroppers and tenant farmers blank. No matter how hard they worked, they were not making enough money to pay their bills, so they remained poor. Okay, guys, do the best you can on this. If you have any questions, you can email me at the address at the end, or you can comment on the video.